Nearly 1 in 3 people today say they're trapped in a relationship that feels emotionally draining, where love feels like walking through fog. You know something's wrong, but you can't name it. One moment, she's warm and present, the next, distant and cold. And you keep asking yourself the same question over and over again. Is she narcissist or emotionally unavailable? That question keeps millions of people awake at night, not because they don't love, but because they can't understand why love hurts this way. Studies in emotional psychology show that confusion, not conflict, is what destroys most relationships. You don't break from shouting matches. You break from silence, from the slow withdrawal that makes you doubt your own reality. If you've ever felt like you were loving someone who's there but not really there, this video will feel like truth finally spoken out loud. We'll explore what's really happening behind her detachment, the hidden psychology, the emotional patterns, and how to free yourself without losing your empathy. But before we dive into the heart of this, do me a small favor. Like this video, hit boost if YouTube offers it, and tell me in the comments, are you dealing with a narcissist or just someone emotionally unavailable? It's said that nearly 40% of modern relationships end not in explosive arguments, but in quiet emotional disconnection. You stop feeling seen, you start questioning yourself, and the strangest part, you can't tell whether the problem is her or you. Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what if the reaction never happens? What if one substance simply absorbs the other until nothing remains? You've probably felt it, the sudden shift. One day she's warm, curious, fascinated by you. The next, she's distant, distracted, almost cold. Conversations become shorter. Affection feels calculated, as if every word and gesture passes through an invisible filter before it reaches you. You start wondering, is she pulling away because she doesn't care or because she's afraid? Is this emotional unavailability or narcissism disguised as love? Sigmund Freud described love as an exchange of narcissisms. We all bring some degree of self-interest into relationships, but when one person's need for admiration eclipses their capacity for empathy, the bond begins to fracture. It's like standing in front of a mirror that reflects only her image. You disappear slowly, replaced by the person she wants you to be. At first, it feels intoxicating. Narcissists are masters of charm, mirroring your desires, making you feel like you've finally been understood. But as Jung explained, the shadow always reveals itself. Over time, the warmth turns to control, and your reality begins to orbit around her moods, her approval, her withdrawal. On the other hand, emotional unavailability is different. It's not driven by ego, but by fear. Eckhart Tolle might say that such people live trapped in the pain body of their past. They crave love, but fear its consequences. They might have grown up in environments where affection was unpredictable, where being vulnerable meant getting hurt. So now, as adults, they pull away not because they don't care, but because caring feels dangerous. You can feel this difference energetically. Narcissism drains you. Emotional unavailability leaves you yearning. One consumes you, the other leaves you starving. But how can you tell the difference when both feel like rejection? Psychology studies show that emotionally unavailable individuals often display ambivalent behavior. They reach out when you start to detach, then withdraw when you get close. It's not manipulation, it's a defense mechanism. They oscillate between craving intimacy and fearing it. Narcissists, in contrast, use withdrawal as punishment. It's calculated, meant to restore control and remind you who sets the emotional pace. Here's where it gets painful. Both patterns can make you question your worth. You start overanalyzing every text, every silence. You might even think, maybe I'm asking for too much. But Socrates once said, the unexamined life is not worth living. The moment you begin examining this dynamic, you reclaim your power. You stop reacting and start observing. You realize that not every absence of affection is proof that you're unlovable. It may simply be proof that the other person has not yet learned how to love without fear or control. Let's look at a real example. Jung's patient, Miss Miller, whom he discussed in Symbols of Transformation, constantly fell for emotionally distant partners. Each relationship mirrored her own inability to confront intimacy. She was, as Jung described, projecting her unlived life onto others. When she met men who couldn't love her fully, she was unknowingly meeting parts of herself she hadn't accepted, her own emotional walls. That's the paradox. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are mirrors, not monsters. Yet, this insight doesn't mean you must tolerate pain in the name of growth. Awareness doesn't excuse behavior. It liberates you from confusion. When someone loves conditionally, when they alternate between affection and absence, you begin to feel addicted to their attention. Studies in behavioral psychology compare this pattern to intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that drives gambling addiction. Unpredictable rewards create obsession. You chase the high of their approval, ignoring the emotional cost. And this is where confusion becomes a mirage. You start mistaking intensity for intimacy, anxiety for passion, silence for mystery. You convince yourself that if you could just be more patient, more understanding, she would finally open up or love you again like before. But in truth, you're trying to fix a reflection that was never yours to fix. The philosopher Alain de Botton once said that love often begins as admiration for another's qualities and ends as an education in our own wounds. When you love someone who oscillates between closeness and distance, you're being invited to confront your own attachment, your need to be chosen, to be validated, to be enough. That's not weakness. That's awareness. So if you're caught in that fog right now, questioning whether she's a narcissist or just emotionally unavailable, start by shifting the question. Ask instead, what part of me keeps reaching for someone who can't reach back? Because that's where clarity begins, not in labeling the other person, but in understanding why confusion feels familiar. In the next part, we'll peel back the mask even further. We'll enter the psychological theater where narcissism is born, not from power, but from deep insecurity, and explore how Freud and Jung's theories reveal what's truly happening behind that seductive, impenetrable smile. Carl Jung believed that what we call narcissism is not simply vanity or arrogance. It's a spiritual wound disguised as confidence. He once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For many narcissistic personalities, that is precisely what they cannot do. They wear masks not to deceive the world, but to survive it. Underneath the charm, the certainty, the control lies a fragile ego terrified of exposure. Freud saw this first. He called it narcissistic injury, the deep inner wound that comes from early rejection, neglect, or humiliation. A narcissist doesn't love themselves too much. They actually love themselves too little. What you see on the outside is not real self-esteem. It's the echo of someone still begging to be seen. When you meet someone like this, it can feel magnetic. You're drawn to their certainty, their confidence, their spark. They know how to read a room, how to mirror your emotions, how to make you feel special. Jung would call this the persona, the mask each of us wears to navigate the social world. But in narcissism, the mask fuses with the face. There is no authentic self behind it, only layers of reflection. You're not meeting her, you're meeting who she believes she must be to stay in control. Freud wrote that narcissism is the child's original state. Before we learn to love others, we love ourselves. For a narcissist, that process never fully matures. Something interrupts it, often in early life. Inconsistent love, overpraise mixed with emotional neglect. Or a parent who sees the child not as a person, but as an extension of their own ego. The result? A fractured identity. The narcissist learns that worth must be earned through admiration, not authenticity. Love becomes a performance, not a connection. And when that performance is threatened, when you stop admiring, when you ask for reciprocity, the mask begins to crack. This is when the confusion begins. They may lash out, withdraw, or suddenly turn cold. Jung described this as the eruption of the shadow, the hidden repressed parts of the psyche that the narcissist cannot face. To admit vulnerability would mean facing the unbearable truth that the image they built is hollow. So instead, they project. They accuse you of being needy, dramatic, ungrateful, anything that shifts the light away from their own darkness. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, "The self is a relation which relates itself to itself. In the narcissist, that relation is broken. They cannot sustain self-reflection without collapsing into shame." Let's look at a real case. Freud's patient known as the Rat Man displayed obsessive tendencies tied to unresolved guilt and fear of rejection. While not a textbook narcissist, his story revealed the core of narcissistic defense. The need to control love to avoid being abandoned. When love feels unsafe, control becomes the substitute. The narcissist builds elaborate defenses, perfectionism, intellectual superiority, emotional detachment, to maintain power. It's not that they want to hurt you. They simply cannot afford to lose control of the image that keeps them safe. Eckhart Tolle described this phenomenon in spiritual terms. He said, "The ego feeds on reaction. It needs your emotional energy to feel alive." That's why arguments with a narcissist never end with clarity. They end in exhaustion. You leave drained. Not because you've lost, but because you've been feeding a wound that cannot be healed from the outside. The more you try to explain, justify, or please, the deeper the wound grows. Modern neuroscience even supports this. Studies on narcissistic personality traits show lower activity in the brain regions responsible for empathy and emotional regulation, but heightened activity in those linked to self-referential thought. In simple terms, the narcissistic mind is wired to protect its identity at all costs. It perceives criticism as an existential threat. So even love, when it feels too real, becomes dangerous. It might expose the fragile self they've been hiding behind charm and confidence. Socrates taught that wisdom begins with knowing one's own ignorance. But the narcissist cannot afford that kind of wisdom. Their entire sense of self depends on being right, being admired, being untouchable. This is why apologizing feels impossible for them. It would mean facing the very emptiness they're running from. Jung wrote that the most dangerous things are those we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves. Narcissism is that refusal made visible, and yet understanding this doesn't mean excusing it. Compassion without boundaries turns into self-destruction. What Freud and Jung both reveal is that the narcissist is at war with themselves, but you are not meant to be collateral damage in that war. Recognizing the mask is not an act of judgment. It's an act of liberation. You stop trying to heal what you didn't break. You start seeing the pattern for what it is, a survival strategy disguised as love. Because beneath all the complexity, the truth is simple. Narcissism is not power, it's protection. It's the fear of being ordinary, unloved, unseen. The tragedy is that in their attempt to be admired, they destroy the very intimacy they crave. In the next part, we'll explore the opposite side of this mirror. Emotional unavailability. Not born from ego, but from fear. A pattern that looks similar on the surface, but beneath it hides not manipulation, but the quiet pain of those who never learned that it's safe to stay. When Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate," he could have been describing emotional unavailability. Unlike narcissism, which thrives on attention, emotional unavailability hides from it. It is not born from the desire to dominate, but from the instinct to protect. And yet, for the person on the receiving end, the pain feels almost identical. Messages left unanswered, affection that fades without explanation, the coldness that settles between two people who once felt inseparable. You might think she doesn't care, but more often than not, she cares too much, and that's precisely what terrifies her. Freud explained that when early attachments are marked by inconsistency or rejection, the mind develops defenses to avoid reliving that pain. Emotional distance becomes armor. These individuals don't wake up deciding to withhold love. They simply never learned how to stay present when love feels real. In childhood, vulnerability meant danger, so as adults, closeness feels unsafe. Imagine someone who grew up in a home where emotions were never talked about, where love was given only when they achieved something or behaved perfectly. They learned early that affection was conditional, that mistakes meant disconnection. As adults, they replicate that pattern. The moment you start getting close, something inside them panics. They might pick a fight, withdraw, or simply need space. To them, love triggers the same nervous system response as threat. It's not rejection, it's survival. Eckhart Tolle often speaks of the pain body, that reservoir of old emotional suffering each of us carries. For emotionally unavailable people, that pain body is easily activated. When you show love, it touches their deepest wound, the fear of abandonment. So they detach to avoid the possibility of being hurt again. The irony, of course, is that by avoiding pain, they recreate it. They build walls so high that no one can reach them, and then feel lonely inside their own fortress. Modern attachment theory calls this the avoidant attachment style. Studies show that people with this pattern tend to minimize emotional needs, value independence excessively, and perceive closeness as suffocating. Yet beneath that independence lies profound fear. Neuroscientific research reveals that their brains actually show heightened stress responses when intimacy increases. They may look calm, but inside their body is bracing for impact. Jung believed that what we repress in ourselves eventually appears in the world around us. If we repress vulnerability, we attract situations that force us to face it. Many people find themselves drawn to emotionally unavailable partners precisely because, deep down, they carry the same wound. Like attracts like, not in a romantic cliché, but in psychological truth. We are magnetized to the familiar, even when it hurts. Socrates once said, "To know thyself is the beginning of wisdom." In relationships, that wisdom means recognizing patterns that repeat across partners. If every relationship feels like chasing someone who won't stay, it's not just about their distance, it's also about your pursuit. The chase becomes an identity. It gives meaning to the chaos. We tell ourselves we just want them to open up, but sometimes we're unconsciously trying to heal our own story through theirs. Let's look at a real story. Elizabeth, a patient of early psychoanalyst Carl Abraham. She repeatedly fell for partners who withdrew emotionally. She described it as loving men who disappeared while sitting next to me. Her therapists realized she wasn't unlucky. She was repeating the emotional rhythm of her father, affection followed by absence. This repetition wasn't masochism. It was the unconscious seeking resolution. She was trying to rewrite her past through the present. But as Jung warned, what you resist persists. Healing didn't begin until she stopped chasing emotional availability in others and started cultivating it within herself. There's a quiet tragedy in emotionally unavailable relationships. Both people usually mean well. There's genuine affection, sometimes even love. But love cannot thrive where fear dictates behavior. You might try harder, communicating clearly, giving space, proving your loyalty. But no amount of external reassurance can calm an internal wound. Freud would call this repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate unresolved trauma in an attempt to master it. But mastery doesn't come through control, it comes through awareness. So, what can you learn from this pattern? First, that withdrawal is not always cruelty. Sometimes it's fear. Second, that your worth is not defined by someone's capacity to connect. And third, that healing begins the moment you stop personalizing another person's walls. You cannot love someone into safety, but you can love yourself enough to stop mistaking their silence for your failure. Eckhart Tolle reminds us that presence dissolves pain. When you stop fighting their distance, you start feeling your own. You realize that beneath your longing lies something deeper, a desire to be seen without effort, to be loved without performance. That is not weakness, it's the most human need there is. But to meet that need, you must first do what the emotionally unavailable cannot. Stay. Stay with your discomfort. Stay with your truth. Stay with yourself. Because emotional unavailability isn't just their story. It's an invitation for you to look inward. To ask, where in my life am I unavailable to my own feelings? When you answer that question, the dynamic shifts. You stop trying to break down someone else's walls and start dismantling your own. In the next part, we'll explore this mirror more deeply, why we're often drawn to those who can't love us fully, and how that attraction reveals our own hidden fears and unmet needs. Carl Jung once said, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." When you fall for someone who's emotionally unavailable or narcissistic, it's easy to believe you're simply unlucky, cursed to repeat the same story. But the truth is more intricate. These relationships don't just happen to you, they reveal you. They act as mirrors, reflecting the unhealed parts of your own psyche that still long for validation, safety, or a sense of being enough. Imagine for a moment that attraction isn't random, that it's a language spoken by your unconscious, a kind of magnetic pull between wounds that recognize each other. Freud called it transference, the projection of old emotions onto new people. This is why emotional distance feels so intoxicating. It awakens the part of you that still believes love must be earned, the part that feels at home in longing. You tell yourself, if I can just reach her, if I can just prove my worth, she'll finally see me. But Jung warned that what we do not make conscious controls us. You're not just chasing her, you're chasing closure with your own past. Socrates would have called this the examined life, the willingness to turn your gaze inward rather than outward. When you ask, why do I keep ending up with people who can't love me fully? You're asking one of the most important questions of your life. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a doorway to transformation. The answer often lies in your earliest emotional blueprint. If you grew up learning that love came through effort, that affection required performance, or that peace meant pleasing others, then emotional distance feels familiar. Familiarity, even when it hurts, feels safer than the unknown. Psychologist John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, discovered that children adapt to their caregivers not out of logic, but survival. If love was inconsistent, the child learned to chase it. If love was controlling, the child learned to comply. And these patterns don't vanish with age. They evolve into adult attraction. We don't consciously choose them. They choose us until we see them clearly. Eckhart Tolle might say that the pain you feel when someone withdraws is not created by them, but awakened through them. It's an echo of your own unconscious belief. I'm only lovable when I'm chosen. The person in front of you becomes the stage where that old story plays out again and again. That's why the pain feels so personal, because it's not just about this relationship, it's about every moment in your life where love felt just out of reach. Real transformation begins when you stop asking, why is she doing this to me? And start asking, what is this experience trying to show me about myself? It's not self-blame, it's self-liberation. Jung said that healing happens when we bring light into the darkness of our own patterns. Maybe you've mistaken intensity for intimacy because you grew up in chaos. Maybe you've mistaken patience for love because you learned to wait for attention. Or maybe you've confused control with safety because unpredictability once felt unbearable. Here's something few people realize. Emotionally unavailable relationships often serve as catalysts for growth. They force you to face the truth about your emotional needs, your boundaries, your self-worth. Many people who awaken to self-awareness can trace it back to one person who could not meet them halfway. The pain becomes a teacher, and like any powerful teacher, it demands your full attention. Let's consider a real example. The writer Anais Nin documented years of relationships with distant, self-absorbed lovers. She confessed that she kept choosing men who couldn't love her because I feared the man who could. That's the paradox. The closer someone gets to loving us for who we are, the more our defenses panic. True intimacy requires self-acceptance, and that's what many of us secretly avoid. We say we want love, but we chase the version that confirms our wounds. Freud once observed that we repeat instead of remembering. You're not broken for repeating that you're human, but awareness allows you to interrupt the loop. When you notice yourself drawn to someone emotionally distant, pause. Instead of asking how to make them stay, ask what their distance mirrors within you. Are you afraid of being truly seen? Are you avoiding vulnerability by focusing on fixing them? Because healing often begins when we stop chasing others and start meeting ourselves. Socrates believed that the path to wisdom begins with humility, admitting that we do not yet know ourselves. Emotional attraction operates in the same way. It humbles you. It reveals your unfinished lessons. But once you see them, the power dynamic shifts. You no longer beg for connection. You become conscious of why you seek it. And consciousness transforms everything. The moment you understand that your longing is not a flaw, but a signal, something inside you changes. You stop needing validation from people who withhold it. You stop mistaking silence for depth. You realize that love isn't meant to be earned, and it's meant to be shared. But to share it, you must first possess it within yourself. In the next part, we'll explore exactly how to reclaim that power, not by closing your heart, but by opening it with discernment. You'll learn how to step out of the emotional chase to protect your energy without losing your compassion, and to finally love in a way that feels free instead of fearful. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But when you've spent years in relationships defined by distance, confusion, or manipulation, that privilege feels more like a challenge. You've been trained, consciously or not, to measure your worth through another's approval. You wait for their response to determine your peace. Their silence dictates your self-esteem. It's not just love you're chasing, it's validation, belonging, proof that you matter. And that is precisely where your healing begins. To reclaim your power, you first have to understand what you've been giving away. Every time you try to decode her mixed signals, every time you rehearse what you could have said differently, you're unconsciously reinforcing the same imbalance that keeps you trapped. Freud observed that the repetition of pain often hides a hidden wish to master it. You think that if you can just get it right this time, the story will change. But mastery doesn't come from control, it comes from release. The moment you stop trying to convince someone to love you, you step out of the psychological loop that feeds their power. Eckhart Tolle teaches that pain is not caused by the situation itself, but by our resistance to it. Emotional liberation begins when you stop resisting reality. If she's detached, let her be detached. If she's cold, don't try to melt her with your warmth. The more you accept what is, the faster illusions dissolve. Acceptance doesn't mean passivity, it's clarity. You're no longer reacting from fear, but responding from awareness. You start to see that love built on anxiety isn't love. It's dependency dressed as devotion. Compassion is your next test. It's easy to swing from empathy to resentment. One moment you want to understand her pain, the next you want revenge for how small she made you feel. Jung warned that what you hate in others is often what you have yet to face within yourself. True compassion doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment, it means seeing the other's suffering without letting it consume you. You can recognize her fear, her defenses, her unhealed wounds, and still choose yourself. That's not cruelty, that's self-respect. Socrates believed that virtue begins with knowledge. Once you understand the root of someone's behavior, you're no longer enslaved by it. Narcissists and emotionally unavailable people thrive on unconscious dynamics, power games that depend on your confusion. When you become conscious, the game ends. You stop explaining your worth, you stop proving your love, you simply observe, and in that observation, you reclaim your freedom. Let's take a real example. In therapy, a woman named Helen spent years in relationships where she felt invisible. Each partner mirrored the same pattern: withdrawal, silence, blame. Her instinct was always to fix, to explain, to be good enough to earn love. But her turning point came when she realized that trying to heal others had become her way of avoiding her own loneliness. She wasn't just trying to love them, she was trying to escape herself. When she stopped running, everything changed. She began to feel what she had avoided for years, the pain of not being chosen. And paradoxically, facing that pain freed her. It lost its power. Freud would call this working through, the process of transforming unconscious pain into conscious insight. It's not about forgetting the past, but integrating it so it no longer dictates your present. You begin to see love differently. You stop confusing effort with intimacy. You stop chasing the unavailable because you no longer crave the chaos that once felt like home. Reclaiming your power also means setting boundaries, not as punishment, but as protection. A boundary is not a wall. It's a mirror that reflects your self-worth. You're not shutting others out. You're deciding what gets to stay in your energy. Eckhart Tolle describes this as non-resistance through presence. You no longer fight what doesn't serve you. You simply stop feeding it attention. When someone tries to draw you back into drama, you meet it with silence, not the silence of retreat, but the silence of strength. And something profound happens when you stop chasing. The energy you once spent decoding, apologizing, fixing, it returns to you. You begin to rediscover your own rhythm, your own peace. You start reading, walking, breathing, without waiting for a message that may never come. You realize you were never missing a person. You were missing yourself. Jung said that every human being carries within them both the wound and the medicine. The same sensitivity that made you susceptible to emotional manipulation is the same sensitivity that will make you wise, compassionate, and deeply grounded if you learn how to direct it inward. When you stop begging for love, you create space for it to grow naturally. You begin to attract people who meet you in truth, not performance. The philosopher Epictetus once reminded his students, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Freedom doesn't come from control over others. It comes from sovereignty over your emotions. To reclaim your power is to return to that sovereignty, where your peace is not negotiable and your value is not conditional. In the next part, we'll explore how to move beyond survival and into awakening, how to transform pain into awareness, confusion into clarity, and love into something conscious, peaceful, and real. Because once you've reclaimed your power, the real journey begins, learning how to love without losing yourself. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. You've walked through that pain, questioned your worth, confronted your patterns, faced the truth of those who could not meet you. But awakening isn't just about seeing the illusion, it's about stepping beyond it. When the fog of confusion clears, what remains isn't bitterness, it's clarity, and that clarity changes everything. At first, you'll notice the silence feels different. It's no longer heavy with waiting, it becomes peaceful. The same moments that once triggered anxiety, no message, no reassurance, no attention, begin to lose their power. Why? Because you've shifted the source of your validation from the outside world to your inner self. Freud once said that maturity is the ability to postpone gratification, but real maturity in love is the ability to exist without needing to be completed by another. You're no longer chasing wholeness through someone else's approval. You're remembering that you were already whole. Eckhart Tolle describes this as the awakening of presence, the moment you stop identifying with your thoughts, your pain, your story. You no longer see love as something to win or fear as something to escape. You simply observe. You realize that all along you were searching for yourself in another person's eyes. And now you've finally come home. This is what it means to transform pain into awareness, to stop seeking understanding from those who cannot give it, and to start listening to the quiet intelligence within you. Think of the philosopher Socrates, who said that the unexamined life is not worth living. But he never meant endless analysis. He meant living consciously, questioning not to judge, but to awaken. You've examined your relationships, your desires, your wounds. Now comes the deeper question. How do you live with this new awareness? Because awakening is not an endpoint, it's a practice. It's in the way you respond to silence, the way you breathe when things don't go your way, the way you love without grasping. You begin to notice patterns in others, not to diagnose them, but to understand yourself. You no longer confuse empathy with rescue. When someone withdraws, you don't chase, you observe. You see fear for what it is. You see control for what it hides. Jung would say that you've integrated your shadow. The parts of you that once sought validation, control, or approval are no longer enemies. They've become teachers. Each painful memory now carries wisdom instead of weight. Real freedom is quiet. It doesn't need closure from anyone else. It doesn't need revenge or recognition. It's found in the stillness that comes after release. When you stop identifying as the victim of your story, you begin to write a new one, not centered on who hurt you, but on who you became because of it. This is how transformation unfolds, not in dramatic revelations, but in subtle shifts. The same text that once broke you now makes you smile. The same silence that once tortured you now feels like peace. Take the example of Rainer Maria Rilke, the poet who wrote about solitude not as loneliness, but as a sacred space. He said, "Love consists in this, two solitudes that protect and touch and greet each other." Once you've healed from emotional confusion, that's the kind of love you begin to crave, not intensity, not obsession, but presence. The kind that doesn't demand performance, that doesn't fear silence. You stop romanticizing chaos and start valuing calm. You stop needing constant reassurance because you trust your own perception. You've learned to discern between someone's energy that feeds your growth and one that feeds your doubts. Freud believed that healing required remembering, repeating, and finally, working through. You've remembered the patterns. You've repeated them enough to understand their cost. Now you're working through them, not by thinking, but by living differently. Each boundary you set, each moment you choose peace over reaction, is an act of reprogramming your nervous system. You're teaching yourself that safety can exist without control, that love can exist without fear. Eckhart Tolle would call this awakening from the dream of separation. You begin to see relationships as mirrors, not prisons. Every person you meet reflects either your peace or your pain. And once you've learned this, you stop running from connections and start walking with awareness. Love becomes a conscious choice, not a rescue mission, not a need, but a gift freely exchanged between two aware souls. This is the beauty of transformation. What once broke you now opens you. The same sensitivity that made you vulnerable now makes you deeply empathetic. You can sense emotional games instantly, but instead of reacting, you smile inwardly. You've learned the subtle art of detachment, not coldness, but calm clarity. You care, but you're not consumed. You love, but you don't lose yourself. In that state, you begin to attract differently. People who once intimidated you lose their power. Those who truly value connection will recognize your stillness as strength. You're no longer chasing reflections. You're walking in light. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of all parts of the self into a whole. It's what happens when you stop searching for love to fill a void and start embodying it as your natural state. And now, as you listen, maybe you realize something quietly powerful. This wasn't a story about her after all. It was about you, about the part of you that mistook pain for love, and the part that finally woke up, about the heart that broke open not to end, but to expand. You've learned that awakening isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you to forget. And in that remembrance, you find peace. Not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of understanding. A peace that says, I no longer chase, I no longer wait. I simply am,